Well, I want to welcome everybody and say you're in for a treat. And that's because of the three remarkable people that are sharing this panel: distinguished and accomplished journalists and thoughtful analysts and commentators on what is going on right now with regard to, as this panel is entitled, the press, misinformation, and the election, which could this be a more timely discussion? So I'm going to introduce Alan Miller and let him introduce his colleagues, but I want to tell you a little something about the News Literacy Project before we begin, because it really came about as a result of my getting to know NLP and Alan inviting Claire and Wes to join us. So I'm going to read from an op-ed that some of you might have read in the Tribune the other week that Alan wrote, in which he said, "The corrosive threat of misinformation permeates every aspect of our civic life. It undercuts our ability to protect ourselves from COVID-19, and it undermines trust in the news media and our democratic institutions, particularly in light of the right of citizens to feel safe and free to cast their ballots." On top of that, just in the last few days, we've all seen, with the announcement that President Trump tested positive for the COVID virus, an explosion of rumors, of misinformation, of conspiracy theories that have flooded social media for many Americans. And against that background, I hope tonight you'll learn a little bit about what NLP is doing to combat this, because it really is a remarkable organization that is nonpartisan, nonprofit, and a national organization that has scaled its ability to help students, educators, and the general public develop the ability to make the smart choices about what is or is not to be trusted. It runs something called Checkology, which is a virtual classroom that you'll hear more about later, but it already serves more than 28,000 educators and 180,000 students in every state, working in many of the largest school districts, including here in Chicago. And more recently, recognizing the need that not only students have, but we all have to perfect or at least advance our news literacy competencies. The NLP has recently launched a podcast called Is That a Fact? And a new newsletter entitled Get Smart About the News. I first met Alan through someone who is on this call, David Hiller, who's a mutual friend. And David and I have known each other for many years, and knowing of my interest in the First Amendment, in independent journalism, and in civic engagement, David thought I should meet Alan. I should say that David and the McCormick Foundation have been stalwart and early supporters of the project. So a couple of years ago, Alan and I had the chance to meet in person, and that began a friendship. And I must say I was struck from the beginning about the ambition of the vision that Alan and his team had. But I have been equally impressed by their accomplishments. And I think you will as well, in learning more about their work and also in seeing the quality and caliber of journalists as represented by Claire and Wes, who have chosen to engage with the project. As some of you know, Alan had a distinguished 21-year career as a journalist himself at the LA Times, winning numerous awards, including the Pulitzer Prize. I'm going to let Alan introduce his colleagues, Wes and Claire, but just as a matter of housekeeping, I want to let all of our engaged participants around the country know that after about a 30-minute conversation among the four of us, we're going to take your questions. So please use the chat function to write your questions during the program, and I'll be incorporating those after we begin our conversation. So Alan, I'm going to turn it over to you to introduce Wes and Claire.
Thanks very much, Christie, for that thoughtful introduction, as well as for graciously hosting this event, which seems to get more timely by the hour. I too want to express my appreciation to David Hiller and the McCormick Foundation for all your generous support during the past decade, and to everyone for joining us this evening. It is my pleasure to introduce Wes Lowery and Claire Wardle, and an honor to join them on this evening's panel. Wes is an outstanding correspondent for CBS News' 60 and 6, a spin-off of 60 Minutes on the mobile app Quibi. 2015, he was a lead reporter on the Fatal Force project at the Washington Post that chronicled and analyzed nearly 1,000 fatal police shootings that year and was awarded the Pulitzer Prize for national reporting. Claire is the co-founder and executive chair of First Draft, which puts her at the forefront of combating misinformation worldwide. She has served as a fellow at the Shorenstein Center at Harvard's Kennedy School, the research director at the Tao Center for Digital Journalism at Columbia University's Graduate School of Journalism, and head of social media for the United Nations Refugee Agency. I'm proud to say that Wes leads our lesson on investigative reporting in Czechology, and Claire leads our lesson on misinformation, two of our most popular and powerful lessons. And Wes is a member of our National Leadership Council as well.
Thanks, Alan. So Wes, I want to start with you because I want to start with a grounding in helping all of us understand what I'll call for the moment the traditional media before we turn to the social media platforms. And I think I express a lot of the concerns we have about in this environment of shrinking resources, in an environment in which there is a challenge in figuring out what is fair balance as distinct from false equivalence, in a world in which it seems as if the press can be manipulated so easily, and so the right stories or the important stories don't always break through. Help us understand a little bit about the context of how news gathering is working in today's environment.
Certainly. Well, first of all, I'm really excited to be here. The News Literacy Project does extremely important work, and as Alan noted, it feels as if almost by the minute these conversations and these topics become increasingly timely. You know, every presidential election year and every 4-year cycle is quite wild one way or the other. Oh, this one might take the cake. And in this moment, not just with our politics, but with global health pandemic, with increasing concern around policing and protests. Right? We have so many stories in our national conversation that require a diligent and trustworthy press for us to sort out what's going on and to understand what's happening. But beyond that, it's just one thing to have the press. The other thing is to be able to, for our readers, to discern what news organizations and outlets they can trust, what reports they can trust, how to evaluate their sources. And so I think the work that NLP does is so crucial and so vital, right? We live in a time where there are a ton of different media outlets, right? We have two simultaneous processes happening at the same time. We're seeing a lot of traditional media being pared back, massive job losses in terms of local newspapers, local television outlets even, and yet we're also seeing the rise in a lot of digital outlets and smaller outfits, in part because the barrier to entry to media is much smaller than it used to be. If one of us can get together tonight and with a domain name and a little graphic design ability, put together a website that looks and feels like a news organization that's been around for decades or centuries, right? And so for readers, especially readers who are very often encountering journalism or things masquerading as journalism in the wild, right? A link on someone's Facebook page, a tweet that's gone viral, as opposed to going through a homepage or receiving a physical newspaper. At times it can be difficult on first glance to figure out where this is, how trustworthy it is, what the processes around it are. And so I think it's as important as ever that we, as journalists who are doing that type of work, are clear and transparent about the work we're doing and how we're doing it, but secondarily, that we equip our readers to the extent possible to identify things that are masquerading as news that maybe are not. We live in a time where it doesn't take very much to send a conspiracy flying across the world. Be it a small doctored video or a clip taken out of context, a report that's just not true from an actor who may or may not be trustworthy. And so it's as important than ever that we have trustworthy, rigorous journalism, and that we continue to fund it and support it. But also, like I said, that we really help our readers and help the public understand how to differentiate between what that is and the rest of it. And so as a journalist working in this space, I think that's extremely important. I think that most readers, most viewers want good journalism. They want to know the truth. They want to understand what's going on. And yet very often they can't spend all day, every day like we do trying to sort out exactly what works and what doesn't. And so I think we have to make it easy for our readers to see the way they can trust us. And the last thing I'll say is that we live in an era that's very much a show me, don't tell me era, right? Because there is so much information out there, so many sites, so many people claiming to have definitive information, writing with bias or attempting to conceal it, that a lot of readers want to see our work. Right? They want to see the documents upon which something is based. They want to see the data set behind it. That unfortunately, no matter what company we work for or where our work is appealing, there is a built-in skepticism because a lot of folks feel like they can't trust what they're seeing. And so I think when we can, it really behooves us to allow our readers to see the work we're doing, see how we came across it, see that there's not some secret agenda behind it or that we haven't. No, hey, we ran this analysis and this is what it looks like. You want to run the analysis on your own in your basement? Feel free. Because again, we live in a moment where a lot of people do want to do that. They want to see it themselves. They want to look at it themselves. And I think for us, people hoping to bring more information in the conversation, to ground our public discourse in facts and discernible truth, I think the more of that we can provide, the better off we are, and it engenders trust with those readers.
I think that you know, I worry about whether I'm being misinformed and whether I'm being careful about where I'm getting my information. But we kind of assume that anyone that actually operates with a newsroom, they're probably have the resources to not be manipulated or misinformed. But Claire, you shared something about the actual manipulation that's going on of newsrooms and the need to have what you called a disinformation reporter. Tell us what that is.
So firstly, like Wes, thank you so much for inviting me to have this conversation. And I'll just very quickly say, I got into this space 10 years ago. I used to be an academic. And back in 2009, the BBC called me on the day that plane landed in the Hudson River. And there was a picture on Twitter with people on the plane, the wings. And the head of BBC News Gathering called me up and said, Claire, you're that Twitter lady. None of our BBC journalists know what Twitter is. We didn't know how to find that picture, how to verify that picture, or whether we could legally or ethically use that picture. We got scooped by CNN. Can you leave your academic job and teach us how to make sure that we're verifying the material we see? And 10 years ago, there might have been 5 hoaxes a year against the BBC. People just trying to see whether they could make a false tweet and can they trick the BBC into running it. Now, I see that in the first hour before I get up. I mean, the change is that bad actors, or whatever we want to call them, whether that's foreign or domestic, they don't have a very large audience. They know that people who do have an audience are the mainstream media. So what they're hoping to do is to essentially fool the media into running false information. That's their number one goal. But the second goal is, if they can't manage that, they hope that the media will debunk that false information in the hope that by doing so, it will give oxygen and legitimacy to that conspiracy or rumor. Now, this is very difficult for newsrooms that have always believed that more sunlight is a disinfectant. The more we report, the better it is. But what's happened in the last few years is that people are trying to twist that and turn that and use the news media's paradigm against itself to say, we're going to trick you into reporting on QAnon. We're going to trick you into, not trick you, but we want there to be conversations about these conspiracies that previously used to be very much in the fringes. And the last thing I'll say is this is increasingly difficult for the news media because, again, in the last 2 years, what we've seen are traditional, reliable sources pushing this content. So back in the day, 5 years ago, I said to the head of CBS News, oh, can you try not to cover those conspiracies? They're like, yeah, sure, Claire. Why would I cover the nasty bits of the internet? Now it's much harder when you've got politicians running for office. You've got the president. You've sometimes got police chiefs. It's a very different environment now where you have traditionally reliable sources pushing this information. If a newsroom doesn't cover it, it looks like censorship. So the challenges here for newsrooms are very difficult. And what we at First Draft do a lot of newsroom training to say, you've got to be careful. You've got to make sure your security is tight. You've got to check out everything. That person who contacts you on Facebook Messenger, who are they? Are you absolutely sure that? And journalists know this instinctively, but it's much easier now to pretend to be somebody else online. And it's harder to do those kind of forensic checks about who these people are. So it's never been a more challenging time, I would argue. in terms of doing the journalism, and that's before we talk about the economic challenges that newsrooms now face.
Well, and it's interesting because there really is a difference, isn't there? I mean, they're related, but a difference between misinformation, disinformation, and what's sometimes even called malinformation. And I wonder, Wes, because I know you've done such distinguished work in covering the important issues around policing and social unrest. And I pivot to that because we talked a little bit about how that's an area that is of, you know, critical interest to the body politic, to the election, and yet it can be manipulated by actors, bad actors, sending out misinformation about police shootings. Share a little bit of what you've seen there.
Certainly, that happens. It happens all the time. And I remember when we went to Ferguson in 2014, now 6 years ago, which was far from the first police shooting, but in many ways kicks off the current era that we are in terms of this conversation. And it was remarkable to watch, being on the ground there and doing the reporting, writing every day for the Washington Post, picking different reporting targets, the disconnect between the conversation happening on the ground and the reporters on the ground, and the conversation happening on the internet, and how those worlds were vastly different worlds. And that information that had seeped into the online conversation, things accepted as fact, were just very often completely baseless. And so what you would see is, you know, so one of the examples I think about is, and this actually began to kick back up again this year quite a bit, but very often with these cases, there's a rush to define the players, be it the police officer or the person involved, so that you can either, you know, if you believe the person involved was a bad person, well, then the shooting must have been justified. If the police officer was a great person or a bad person, it's this desire to superimpose a good guy, bad guy narrative based on other information, past interactions, criminal records, and what we see almost to a case are viral memes, very often purportedly to be about the victim in the case, the person who has been shot by a police officer. And case by case, there's almost always cases of these memes that are just completely baseless, right? And so in Ferguson, there were these alleged photos of Michael Brown with guns and weapons, except they weren't photos of Michael Brown. In Trayvon Martin, there's still this vast online conspiracy theory that he was specifically buying a specific type of iced tea so that he could make a drug cocktail mix. And so he must have been, and again, this is pervasive as you drill into the one layer into the internet conversation, right? And so this happens time and time again. Now, initially, as journalists in more traditional spaces, the inclination was to ignore this conversation completely, right? Of course, it wasn't coming into my reporting because it was baseless. It wasn't real. It wasn't factual. There was no desire, or there was no need. But as this played out, and as it continued to play out, it became clear that we had a more complicated responsibility here. That if 90% of my readers were consuming something that was objectively false, they were already consuming it, what was my responsibility, at the very least on social media, to say, actually, I've reported out this viral meme, it's not true, it doesn't work, it doesn't, and I think there's a push and pull, you know, as Claire was saying, and I think this is really important and really crucial for us to think about in the media in this moment, is that we do provide platform to any person or idea that we cover. That providing someone coverage in and of itself is not necessarily a neutral act. It is something that...
it's an amplification.
Correct. And that there are decisions that go into that type of, or there should be decisions that go into that type of amplification, because by the very nature of placing someone on our front page or in our newscast, we are signaling to our readers and our viewers that this is a person worthy of discussion in this capacity, right? And so I think that there is a lot of discussion to be had around that. And I think that, in the spaces I work in, we see this very often with white supremacist groups, and the ways that they are very successful at manipulating the media to gain additional attention. and the way that they launder through our institutional standards of calling them and if they're broadly newsworthy, that means they get to talk to us in our pieces, using that essentially as recruiting tools and sometimes also as branding exercises. And so I think we have to be, as always, and we take this for granted, right? But one of our values as journalists has to be to provide the smartest type of coverage each time we provide coverage. And sometimes that means slowing down and saying, on topics that have stakes, especially when we're talking about covering people who themselves are involved in hatred or in violence, right? What is the smartest way to provide this coverage that doesn't censor things from our readers, but also does not inadvertently provide sympathetic platform or even neutral platform to people whom we do not believe to be neutral actors?
So let's pivot a little bit to the social media side of things, which, as you've been talking about, is often, on the one hand, it's a great small d democratic platform in which people can share opinions and ideas, but it also can spread misinformation that then can cross over into the traditional media. And the documentary that's just come out, Social Dilemma, talks a lot about the power of the algorithm to take people down these rabbit holes. I just saw a study that YouTube's algorithmic recommendations are responsible for 70% of the views. So it's not mostly people searching, it's mostly people being served up things. So Claire, you talked a little bit about your background and being the Twitter lady. Can you talk a little bit about where you think there is an opportunity for regulation and what you think we should expect the social media companies themselves to do, where we think government has to take action? And then, Alan, I want you to talk about where things like Checkology can teach people to navigate that world. But Claire, start us off there.
Yeah, I mean, you mentioned the documentary, The Social Dilemma, and it is an extraordinary documentary in the fact that it's got people talking about this topic. And I think on that issue, there's this kind of knee-jerk, oh my goodness, something has to be done. And certainly these conversations, we've been having them since 2016. These platforms scale too quickly. They are causing harm. The problem is we don't have an empirical foundation upon which to regulate safely. So we have got some really problematic legislation in places like Singapore and Brazil and South Africa that blame people for sharing misinformation, or they, as a government that doesn't like particular types of speech, they want that flagged or taken down. We shouldn't be in that space. What I would love to see regulation do is require the platforms to be audited. At the moment, they publish their transparency reports, but they're marking their own homework. They tell us how well they've done, and we're meant to be like, well done. But they're the people who've written the transparency reports. I, as an independent researcher, cannot go and check those numbers to say, are they right or not? Last year, we actually did a study with people in 14 countries and asked them to take a screen grab of what they saw when they searched for vaccines on Google, YouTube, Instagram, and Facebook. It will surprise nobody that the results weren't very good. The only way we could get that data was to get people in 14 countries to send us screenshots. That is crazy to me that we don't have a way to independently audit these platforms to say, what do people find when they search things? What do they see, Christie? What does the recommendation algorithm serve up Wes on a Saturday night? I mean, we don't, everything is in this black box. So I say very loudly, it's not that we don't need government intervention, but I don't want government intervention until we really can understand the scale of the problem and the impact of the problem. And at the moment, there's a lot of kind of gut instincts about this, but we absolutely must demand that kind of data. And that's where governments can step in. They can demand that.
Can require the information and more transparency. So Alan, because you focused a lot of NLP's efforts initially on school children for whom they are digital natives, that's where they would, I'm sure, overwhelmingly be getting their information and news. What are some of the sort of tools and lessons that you have taken out there that you're finding are actually helpful for navigating this?
I would say, first of all, even if the next generation are digital natives, they by no means have the capabilities to navigate this incredibly fraught information landscape in a way that they're finding what information they should trust and share and act on. We've seen that, over more than a decade now in the classroom. And so, we provide them with resources to be able to be mindful about what they're encountering and make judgments about who created this, for what purpose, is there verification and documentation, what kind of bias may there be, what kind of bias am I bringing to what I'm looking at, and ultimately to make a decision, should I trust this, should I share this, should I act on it as an informed and engaged participant in democracy. We've also discovered that the general public needs these resources, and that this is a multi-generational challenge. And we really want to see a new kind of mindfulness about sharing information so that people take a sense of personal responsibility and say misinformation stops with me. So one of the things we've done, we've created, as you mentioned, Christie, resources for the general public. And we're also engaged in a campaign to combat misinformation intended to suppress voting around the election, because we know there's a great deal of this going on. It happened in 2016 with both the Russians and domestic actors, and it's happening again. So at the heart of this effort, we've created a series of short, engaging PSAs, audio and video in English and Spanish, that are aimed particularly at battleground states and marginalized communities, to inoculate people against being told that you can vote by text or poll, or that your voting place has been closed or moved, or that your election has been canceled or postponed, and to encourage them to get a wide range of credible sources about the election and voting. And working with Comcast and Scripps, these have already reached with millions of Americans before they as they're going and before they are casting their ballots.
So you talked a little bit about voter suppression in the context of the election, and I think one of the things that worries me is that we're going to have a very different election night because of the high percentage of mail-in ballots that won't be counted that night. What are some of the things that you all think the media needs to be doing or doing differently to help prepare and communicate with the country when our traditional methods of, X% of precincts have voted seems not relevant to the way this election is going to play out? Claire?
Yeah, it's all about managing expectations and preparing people for this. You can tell from my accent, I'm not from Brooklyn. I mean, there are many countries where you would not expect to get the result that evening. And I think, we saw in Iowa the kind of breathless, oh my God, why haven't we got the results? So I'm worried. We've already seen how bad it could get. And I think talking to Secretary of States from places like Washington, who've been doing this for a number of years, and I think we have to think about our design of our swingometers and big maps. When we turn things from red to blue, are we explaining this is how many precincts we would expect at this time of night to be reporting? I mean, we're going to need a different language. We're going to need a different visual language, and we need to prepare audiences now. But I might also have a concern is if we have this kind of 3-day period where there's no result and the media isn't in those spaces, do those spaces, that vacuum, get filled with misinformation? So it's going to be a really delicate balance. And I think newsrooms are starting to have these conversations, but it's going to be a very different dance on the evening of 3rd November.
Let me intersperse some of the questions that are coming in, and I won't always identify the questioner, but in this case, he's a friend and known to the panelists too. So my friend Larry Kramer, also a distinguished journalist, asks this question. You're frequently unable to learn who's at the other end of a malicious posting, and it's equally difficult to understand what the motivation might be. Given that, how do you find them and punish them? And is there software that helps you search for them?
Well, I think on the media side of this, right, it has become increasingly complicated and complex to confirm people's identities, confirm they are who they say they are, to confirm their information is real. And I think we always have taken precautions and steps, but I think we have to be extremely careful around that. And I think we also have to be discerning about people who have proven themselves to be questionable sources presenting information to us. And so an example where I thought this went well, an example where I thought it didn't go well very recently, the right-wing provocateur Jacob Wohl self-reported that he had been raided by the FBI and he had not been. Although that didn't prevent some major news outlets, I believe, including the Post, from reporting him in his own publicity stunt. On the other hand, very recently we saw a quote-unquote sting from the conservative provocateur James O'Keefe specifically around issues of voting and election integrity that I think most of the mainstream media didn't touch with a 10-foot pole, and now we have seen additional reporting that have shown the ethical problems and the lies built into it. And so we do have to be aware that in this environment there are a lot of malicious actors out there. When it comes to actually punishing the perpetuators of misinformation, I think that's really a question for the tech companies and the platforms, and it's a question, frankly, that presumes that the platforms are even interested in doing that. That we've had a debate for years since the advent of these social media companies about whether or not they played moderation roles at all, and to what extent that was their job or desire, their disinterest in taking on that responsibility, with the exception of in the most extreme cases, and even in those cases, we're seeing a failure for that. You know, we're having platforms, Facebook, for example, that currently says it will take down things that perpetuate violence, and yet we see example after example where that hasn't quite happened. And so the internet still remains a bit of a wild west as it relates to actual punitive measures for folks who are proven to be bad faith actors, proven to be malicious actors, especially in these social media spaces. And what's also true is that even as some of these cases are taken down, are delegitimized, unfortunately, copycats and mimics pop right up in their stead. And so again, I think for us as journalists, one of the keys here is being remarkably careful, again, about to whom we provide platform, to guarding ourselves in terms of who we allow to be sources, how that operates. And also, like I said, what I would also say is understanding the stakes. Sometimes these provocateurs and folks are people who we cover as novelties. And in the process of doing that, we in fact inflate them and create additional standing. So you think about the Milo Yiannopoulos of Breitbart, the Chuck Johnsons prior to that, people who had a lot of things written about them, like, look at this crazy guy doing these things. And that, in fact, was where they drove a lot of their power.
And how do journalists distinguish, and how are we as consumers supposed to distinguish between what might be being spread by bots? How do we understand that?
Yeah, I'll just take that one very quickly, because I think this question of attribution is a really important one. And for the last 4 years, we've had so many conversations about the Russians that unfortunately it's very tempting to, when we see these kind of, as somebody said, like misinformation cells, immediately say it's Russia. And actually we see kind of domestic hoaxers pretending to be Russia. And we've seen people using Google Translate to pretend that they're Russians. But this question of bots is an interesting one. The platforms actually have taken stronger steps against automated accounts. They're not perfect, but they have taken steps, which means that bad actors actually are less likely to use automated techniques now. We see more cyborgs, which are humans who look like they're bots because they sit all day and they press publish. Sometimes they're doing that for money. Sometimes they're doing it because they're really, really, really passionate about a particular candidate or topic. And so the challenge for this perspective from the platforms is, when does that become coordinated inauthentic behavior, which is a Facebook term? But we do have to be careful around this question of attribution, because in many ways, the way, as somebody asked, how do you do this? It's very, very difficult to do this in real time. These investigations often take a couple of months, and it's when the platforms align with the intelligence community to share notes, and then they come out with a big investigation. And unfortunately, journalists are often not part of those conversations or don't have access to the kind of information that you would need to know that. So that's why journalists have to be so careful and not just assume that these are foreign actors. But these real-time attribution questions are a real challenge and something, again, that we train on. But it's very easy to leap to say it's Russians under the bed. It's almost never the Russians.
So if one of our objectives is to engender trust in the trusted sources, what are some of the mistakes made or things that should be done differently by the media to build more trust? For example, there's this whole conversation around bias versus objectivity? And would it be better if, all reporters, not just your op-ed writers, just kind of said, yes, I'm biased. These are my biases. I'm still going to try and, cover this white supremacist rally objectively, even though I'm a target of it, or whatever the example is. What do you all think might be done by the media itself to earn more trust?
I do think that institutional humility is helpful in this.
Humility generally, I find, is helpful.
Right, and so that builds off of that. I actually think that is what lies at that conversation about accepting that we have individual biases, is the tension between wanting to say, that's not true at all, I am an unbiased journalist, I am objective X, Y, and Z, which is a projection of what we hope our product to be. And I think that can be in tension with the reality of the fact that we're all human beings. And I think that sometimes with an average reader, there is something to be gained from saying, look, I'm working the hardest I can on this. I want to hear I want to hear everyone on this. And having some built-in humility there, I do think is important. I think the transparency we were talking about earlier, I think is important. Not talking in our journalistic voice of God when we don't actually know the full extent of a thing. A lot of things we cover are stories that are in progress, right? And I think in the past, the sense was, well, we'll talk in voice of God on Monday, and if by Tuesday we learn some more, well, we'll write that in the voice of God too, even though that's not quite congruent with what we said the day before. And then if 2 weeks from now, in a Sunday piece, we find out a bunch of new information, we will again come back. And I think that sometimes having more clarity about what we don't know, what remains unclear, again, it's a humility not just in our disposition, but in our writing and presentation of work itself. Because there's nothing more dangerous than saying that something is absolutely the case and then it's turning out to be a little grayer than that. It undermines our credibility. And so I think I think all of that is extremely, extremely important. I also think that, I also think that when we talk about this space, when we talk about online conspiracy, when we talk about whether it be groups like QAnon, when we talk about some of the white supremacist groups and others, right? That sometimes there's an institutional condescension towards smart coverage and analysis of these spaces, because it's all just a bunch of internet people and who knows what they're doing and who knows what they're up to and this. And I think that sometimes that leads us to misunderstand the world that we're living in, because so much is playing out in these online spaces and we are kind of insistent that it's not a big enough deal to devote our true resources and reporting to, much less to develop an expertise in, right? And so when you think about the culture of the world we live in currently, one of the biggest moments that gets us to the space we are is the hoax documentary Loose Change about 9/11, right? There's like a massive cultural moment where you have a conspiracy that spreads through the internet and burrows into the mainstream. And yet something that largely, I not necessarily would have argued that it needed more coverage, quote unquote, but something that in a lot of respectable journalism spaces wasn't a conversation we were all going to engage in, right? And so I think that sometimes we have to be willing to meet our readers where they are, understand what they're talking about, understand what these other inputs are, what they're reading online, where this is coming from, so that it equips us to address the biases they may be coming into our reporting with.
So it is an interesting balance between, on the one hand, being too dismissive and on the other hand, amplifying. Mm-hmm. And then it does go back to, well, what obligation do all of us have as consumers and what tools do we have? And so we have another question from someone who I'll give a shout out to because he's also a distinguished journalist and a friend, David Lipoff. And I want you to take this one, Alan, because he asks a really interesting question. How willing are people, even students, using the NLP tools to change or even experiment with ways of informing themselves that break their habitual patterns of how they would gain information? Do they really change?
Well, we've seen that students who are doing our Checkology lessons find it quite empowering to learn how to navigate this landscape. I mean, they learn the difference between news and opinion and advertising and propaganda. as a starting point. And then the standards of quality journalism, which, however imperfect we all know they may be in practice, we use as an aspirational yardstick against which to measure all news and information. They also learn about the vital role of the First Amendment and a free press and a democracy. And so they are much better equipped to determine the credibility of what they're looking for, to understand what is news and what distinguishes news from so much else of what they're getting through social media and on their feeds. And we've seen that they come away with a greater understanding of those standards, to look for them, to demand them, an understanding of the First Amendment and the role of the press, and also a greater confidence and ability to discern and consume credible information. And we know it does change their patterns of both consumption and of sharing, and makes them connected to the wider world. So we believe that we've seen a lot of reason for hope that we can build this news literacy into the American educational experience, and as a vital and essential life skill in the environment in which we live today.
So we've talked obviously about the election, and we've talked about the media's role in what's going to be an unusual election. I wonder, how optimistic are any of you about the media approaching it in the way, Claire, that you were describing it, a more nuanced recognition of we're not going to know everything the first night? Are you generally optimistic about that? Or are you worried about that?
I'm incredibly pessimistic.
Thank you so much for that.
But news is very routinized. And I've definitely spoken to lots of senior people in newsrooms who are like, listen, lady, I've done difficult elections before. And I think my only concern about that is that journalists who don't spend all day in networked environments, who don't understand how these kind of players push certain frames and narratives, this will be about controlling the narrative. So whoever gets out there first, 2000, we remember, it was only 2 hours that basically CNN called the election for Bush, but that allowed for 36 days, this idea of Gore as a sore loser. Like, that was in 2000, before social media, before the country was as divided as it is now. And my worry is that the real-time decisions that newsrooms are going to have to make, and the fact that, newsrooms compete, all of those environmental factors do not fill me with the kind of idea that we're going to be okay on the 3rd of November. My worry is that I really, really hope not. But my fear is that I think it might go badly, that will cause everybody to say, we cannot go through this again. What lessons do we need to learn? Newsrooms are very good at postmortems. They're very bad at pre-planning. So I think there'll be a lot of postmortems after the fact. But who knows? Maybe this will all go swimmingly.
Walt Mossberg, who's also very involved with NLP, has sent in a question about commenting on Facebook's announcement today that it is banning QAnon entirely from both Facebook and Instagram, regardless of whether the posts are promoting violence. Given that Facebook has in the past made announcements that it hasn't really followed through on, what's anybody's sense of what we're likely to actually see there in terms of actions?
Well, very quickly, I'll just say I've just been looking at my team who are right now monitoring QAnon moving on to Parler and MeWe and Telegram and other spaces. So they might not be on Facebook and Instagram, but they're going to go elsewhere. But I'm with Walt. We've seen these kind of statements again, and unless independent researchers and journalists go looking, you will see that it's still there. So I'm not holding my breath, unfortunately.
Mm-hmm. So in the context of kind of navigating this world, we talked a little bit about the idea of false equivalence versus objectivity and balance. And Wes, you've worked at a number of different news organizations. How do you think about that? How do you think about finding the path?
So I think about it, and not everyone agrees with me, but I think about it much more about fairness. And is our reporting and the way we're presenting something, is it fair? Is the process we've taken fair? Is the presentation of what we're talking about fair? And as a reader, walk away with a grasp of the truth. So you can write a balanced article that results in the reader not understanding that there is not in fact a dispute over the thing that appears disputed. You can write a neutral article, although if I'm writing an article about a murder, I probably don't want it to be neutral. I would like my reader to understand the murder was a bad thing. And so very often we have in our conversation flattened the concept of the pursuit of objective product and fair product, and we have started to group that with a lot of other things: neutrality, partisan balance, like all of these. And I think at times that can be complicating. I think as a general rule, at 10,000 feet, I think we want to be humble and we want to be deliberate, right? We should never be doing something in journalism because this is the way we've always done it, right? That in each individual article, in each individual project, we should be making decisions about how do we handle covering this person, this case, this story. And I think that, so for example, in the policing space where I've spent a lot of time, well, the police saying something in a press release does not in fact mean we should put that in the headline. Now, for generations of reporting and newspaper reporting, that's how we would operate, right? Knife-wielding man shot shot at bank, police say. Well, a reader encountering that headline does not believe there is any potential for debate about what's happened. They are dealing with it as a factual matter. We are in the voice of God declaring that this man was wielding a knife and bearing it in an attribution at the end of a sentence. I think that sometimes we have to be willing to, I think fairness requires of us sometimes a willingness to state what we don't know, a clarity about where our information has come from and where the information has not come from. We have not interviewed the man, right? We've only gotten this from the police. I think those are easy examples. I think as we start talking about online information and disinformation, it becomes increasingly complicated. Although I don't necessarily think we even do well on the easy examples. I think it's easy to not parrot law enforcement or government language, and yet I think very often we do still do that. And so I think that across the board, we've got to be willing to be clear about what we know and what we don't know, and be clear about our sourcing, and also, again, just because we've always used the law enforcement language, officer-involved shooting, or quote, in the line of duty, which in any other context we might see as not objective, a valorizing statement, right, on what which would otherwise be neutral coverage or objective coverage, right? I think that there are a lot of spaces where, because we've always done a thing a certain way, we stop questioning whether or not it works or should work. And what we don't realize sometimes as it relates to trust in communities is that there are communities that already do not trust us because of those types of decisions. And I think that there's a way to balance that out a little bit.
And it seems to me, Wes, that what you're talking about, which is really important and interesting, is that almost the kind of framing bubble that one gets inside and the need to break out of that. And in the bigger sense, I think one of the things that worries me and a lot of other people with regard to our democracy is the kind of parallel universes that people are living in terms of their news and their information, and the dramatic contrast with not very many decades ago when, there were basically 3 broadcast networks and everyone got the same information. We might have very different opinions about it. We might debate policies, but we weren't debating in the main basic facts and information about our institutions. Do any of you have any thoughts about what can be done that would help break that kind of problem we have right now of people living in their, in the proverbial Fox bubble or the MSNBC bubble, that either media organizations, social media organizations, individuals, the project can help address?
Well, I can speak to NLP. I mean, the hyperpolarization of media, of the perception of media, and people seeing it through prisms of red and blue, just really further perpetuates, I think, this challenge of living in 2 realities. So we encourage students to get a wide range of sources, to get diverse sources. We teach them about the role of algorithms to personalize information, which further heightens their filter bubble that may not be aware of, and to challenge their own assumptions. I think this is why it's so critical that we're reaching them at a point where they're forming habits of mind and consumption habits that will last a lifetime, so they don't get quite as deeply locked in as we've seen so many people today.
Well, I agree with that. It's one of the reasons why I worry so much about the tendency away from kind of humility and free expression on campuses, because it seems to me if we're not teaching students to be broad-minded about points of view, that does not speak well for the prospects of the next generation. Claire, I know you made the point about other countries, and I wonder, are there things that we could learn from either policies being pursued that are working or policies that were pursued that demonstrated their failures as other governments wrestle with some of the social media company platforms as well as the broader, kind of media ecosystem?
Yeah, I mean, I think I made a joke earlier about my accent, but you can imagine that I grew up in a place that the BBC was the lifeblood of the country, and it still is, and it's made mistakes. Its coverage of Brexit was not perfect by any stretch. But I do struggle living in a country now where, of course, there is strong public media, but nowhere near where I wish it was. And in the UK, I think it's something like 89% of Brits bump into the BBC at some point during the day. And so you do have this kind of shared sense of, even if people are listening to the radio and popular music, they bump into the kind of half-hour news bulletin. And I really wish that there was more of an understanding that kind of government should be playing a role. I think when we see the collapse of the journalism ecosystem and we understand what that means in the absence of that, how can we ensure that there are ways to have independent funding sources for independent media? How can we be more innovative of ways of thinking about it's not just advertising that should be driving the media? And we're seeing the growth of kind of non-profit newsrooms in the US, but they tend to be small, it's difficult to scale. And I just think as we see the news deserts in the US, we see them in many other countries like Brazil and even in the UK, that's my fear. I mean, what does the ecosystem look like in 10 years' time? And unfortunately, we don't have the luxury of sitting down and stroking our chins and be like, this is a difficult problem to solve, because as that's happening, we see the growth of misinformation in those vacuums. We see, politicians not being held accountable. It's really, really serious. So I wish that this country has a lot of money for philanthropy, but I wish there was a way to think about more innovative ways of a kind of a model for public service broadcasting. Mm-hmm. That looked a little bit different. So that's just it's not
that's helpful. I want to ask each of you as we're coming to the close to share with the audience, what is it that most worries you, but also what is it that most makes you hopeful? And Wes, let's start with you.
Well, that's a tough one, right? I think that, I think the things that make me most hopeful are organizations doing news literacy work like NLP, organizations doing nonprofit work, be it the ProPublicas and the Marshall Projects, groups like City Lab based in Chicago, which is doing a ton of work around not only telling the stories in these neighborhoods and these organizations, but empowering local people to tell their own stories and cover their own communities, I think is extremely important. I think the thing that I think about, to build off of what Claire is just saying a lot, that worries me is the massive amount of the public perception of media that is tied up in cable news coverage, which in fact makes up a relatively small percentage of the journalism being produced or journalists out there, yet makes up the largest, I would argue, perception of when people are talking about the media and the way a thing is covered.
That's what they mean.
That's what we're talking. I mean, the reality was very few of us here, I would surmise, are concerned about the New York Times getting the election wrong on the front page on November 3rd or November 4th. Whatever they write is very likely going to be...
As long as they retire that needle.
But very likely it's going to be nuanced, it's going to reflect complexity, it's going to have humility. What we're concerned about is cable news networks declaring things in one direction or another. And so I think that there's a lot, when we turn on the networks, we see nothing but politics, which happens to be the most divisive thing in our public discourse, and the easiest thing to prompt accusations of bias. despite the fact there are lots of other things that might be happening in the country or in the world in a given day that you might want to learn about on a news channel. And so I do think that the extent to which a lot of our news in the States is big business and entertainment, that it thrives off of this conflict and thrives off of this hyper politicized moment.
That's the business model.
We're not going to fix it. It doesn't make any sense. We're making money off of it. Not me. I would love if someone would like to send me the money. That's fine. But the sense is this is how our major, the most prominent news organizations in our country with the biggest reaches, that's what they thrive off of monetarily. And so there's not much incentive to change that.
Claire?
I would say this because we were talking about news literacy and younger people, but I have the most incredible team of young journalists. And when I spend time with them, and they've grown up with the internet, they know this stuff, they know innovation, and they've got really innovative ways of how to tell stories that feel authentic. So I love spending time with them, and they really do give me hope. I just hope that there is a news ecosystem for them to really grow into and to be great editors in 20 years' time. So have we got time to connect that time frame?
I like that. Having worked with groups like the Student Press Law Center and FIRE over the years, who are slightly older, yes, it does instill not just hopefulness, but enthusiasm. Alan, give us your worries and hopes.
Well, my worry is that we're at an inflection point as to whether facts will continue to matter, whether emotion will overwhelm reason, particularly online, and conspiracy theories and viral rumors overwhelm credible and verified information. My hope is that I do think that 2016 was a wake-up call for many people when we saw what was going on the social media platforms, when we saw the role of Russian disinformation and the impact on the election. So there's much greater awareness. We saw that in terms of educators, in terms of the news media itself, and in terms of donors to NLP. So I think there is an opportunity amid that greater awareness and concern to create a more news literate electorate and a future founded on facts.
So let's wrap up, Alan, by maybe you're sharing a little bit of what the resources are with which NLP functions and how people can choose to stay engaged with you and Wes and Claire, and as importantly, be supportive of the News Literacy Project and its commitments.
Sure. So at this critical moment for our democracy, we very much welcome everybody's involvement with NLP, whether to learn more about us, to receive our resources or share them with others, or to support us. This includes access to Checkology, our weekly newsletters that debunk the most recent misinformation, our game-like news literacy mobile app for all ages called Informable, and our weekly news literacy podcast, Is That a Fact? You can learn more about NLP and connect with us at newslit.org, and you'll also receive an email from us tomorrow with links and ways to support us and engage with us.
Thank you. And on behalf of everyone who participated by asking questions and engaging, I just want to say thank you so much to Alan, to Claire, and to Wes for all that you do and for sharing of your experiences and perspective and wisdom this evening. Thank you.
Thank you, guys.
Very much.
Thank you. Thank you, Christie.